understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics.
And I'm Dillon. I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
So it is Holy Week. This is episode 29. We thought it would be a good time to talk about the phrase Good Friday. So we are going to talk about the phrase Good Friday, what it means, and we're going to talk about all kinds of symbolism wrapped up and liturgical practices, just all kinds of things about Good Friday. We have a lot of information for you, but we're going to try really hard to keep it succinct. So first, why do we call it good? Good Friday is during Holy Week. It is obviously Friday of Holy Week, which is the week leading up to Easter. And Good Friday is the day we commemorate the crucifixion of Jesus. So it seems kind of strange that we call it good, right? So today we're going to get into what this means. So let's just start with the language of it. The word good in Good Friday actually comes from the Old English word meaning holy, pious, or sacred. So Good Friday meant something like Holy Friday or Sacred Friday, and we still call it Good Friday. There's some like liturgical kind of things where people are like, oh, it's good because we know the ending, right? And you could argue that, but really it's about translation. We call it good, but good in Old English didn't mean what it means now.
Correct.
Yeah. Do you want to kind of get into some of the liturgical practices before we really talk about some of the biblical symbolism of Good Friday?
So Good Friday is interesting in that it has its own liturgy. There's multiple liturgies for Good Friday. There's something called the Tenebrae service, which comes out of the European tradition. Some churches will celebrate Tenebrae. It's called the Tenebrae service. And the Tenebrae service has to do with the lighting of very small votive candles. And
this is a service that churches have on Fridays.
Yeah.
Is that what our church does?
No, only on Good Friday.
Good Friday.
I mean, you could do Tenebrae anytime, but it's very connected to Good Friday.
Does our church do that kind
Our
of service?
church does not do Tenebrae. A Tenebrae is a service that happens on Good Friday with very small votive candles in absolute darkness, except for the votive candles.
Okay.
Most churches have what's known as the Good Friday liturgy. So in the Lutheran Church, we have a liturgy which is a special service just for Good Friday. And it is based upon a similar service that the Roman Catholic Church has, as well as the Episcopal Church. And it follows certain forms.
Now set the scene though, because there's Good Friday, but the day before Good Friday is Maundy Thursday. At the end of that service, in many liturgical churches, the altar is stripped. So if you go to church Holy Week on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe Saturday, depending on your church, but then Sunday for Easter, you can really feel the emotion of the whole week. So Thursday, the altar is stripped and it's kind of naked up there, right? And then Friday, you come in because it's about Jesus dying and being murdered on the cross. So it's really like dark and solemn.
So usually on Good Friday, the services of Good Friday, most of the church will be bare or stripped because of Maundy Thursday, as you said. And if liturgical paraments, which are kind of decorative pieces of...
You just said liturgiment. I kind of like that.
Yeah. Which are decorative pieces of fabric that usually hang from like the pulpit and the lectern and all these things, the altar. There are either none of them at all, the sanctuary is completely bare with none of them, or alternative colors can be black. Black meaning that it is a somber day of death and reflection on the death of Jesus and the mourners who mourned his death.
Which
black
makes sense. People wear black to funerals, right? It's very cultural.
And the other permitted. So if you have you would either have it just bare. There's nothing. There's no decorativeness at all. And then the other two colors, like I said, are black. That's the most common color. And then the second would be a deep red, or sometimes known as scarlet. And that has to do with the blood shed on the cross.
Yeah.
And so I know in our church, the color is black. We do have black decorative paraments. It's one of the only days where I wear a black robe and a black stole, because that's what the day calls for.
There's no communion during a Good Friday
There
service.
is no communion.
Talk about why.
Communion is a celebration of the resurrection. Yes, it reminds us of the death of Jesus, but it reminds us that in the bread and wine, Jesus is present with us. We have talked about this in other episodes. Jesus is present with us and alive. And so when we celebrate the great feast of feasts on Easter, we wait to celebrate communion until Easter, because communion is a proclamation of not how could I say this?
Right.
It is a proclamation of Christ's living presence with us. And on Good Friday, the church for centuries has deemed that is not a time to which you would celebrate communion. Now, here's an interesting practice. Some churches, this is not in the Lutheran Church, in some churches, bread and wine that was blessed on Maundy, Thursday is kept in a special place, and it is kept in reserve. And so on Good Friday, there is a minority of Christian churches that will distribute communion, but they will not celebrate communion. Those are two. I know that sounds like, well, that's just semantics. There's a very different thing. There is no communion service. It's just the distribution of bread and wine. The Lutheran Church.
Do people take it in them?
They take it.
Receive it in them?
They receive it. They receive it, but it is from what's called the reserve sacrament, and the Lutheran Church does not have that. So no communion on Good Friday. Either no colors, or black or red, and you could do the Tenebrae service or the Liturgy of Good Friday, which is its own specific service. Should we talk about like special times that the services are usually held? Or
Sure.
So they're either usually held in the evening after dusk, in this kind of idea that
Jesus has died.
Jesus has died, and
Which we're going to talk about the timeline.
yeah, there's an idea. So you would do it after dusk. So like our service at our church is at 7:00. It is dusk. It's getting dark, and we're remembering that darkness came over the world. The other two times to have services are at noon or at 3:00, or from noon to 3, and those are known as the hours of agony.
Well, that's actually a good setup for what I wanted to talk about next, which is, so Good Friday is the day we commemorate Jesus' crucifixion. In case you haven't heard, there's a man named Jesus, and he died on a cross.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Oh.
And if you read the story of Jesus' crucifixion in the Bible, which is in all 4 Gospels, right?
It is in all 4 Gospels.
Right. You will notice that it is told in 3-hour intervals. And let's talk about that, because that's really, really important, I think, to the story. Do you think it's really important?
Oh, absolutely.
As important as I do?
Absolutely.
So they didn't have timekeeping systems that divided time down to precise seconds, minutes, or hours. Instead, Roman military timekeeping divided the day into 12 segments of what's called watches, right? So if you think about like the military, right? They have watches where you stay up and kind of watch for everything and make sure nothing is going wrong. So you take like first watch or second watch, right? So soldiers operated in these shifts and these watches. And each shift was about 3 hours long. Remember, they didn't have clocks like we have them now. So these first watches, the first watch, or often called the first hour. Does that make sense the way I explained it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The first watch, which was often called the first hour, was from about 6:00 to 9:00 a.m. The third hour was roughly 9 a.m. to noon. The 6th hour was from about noon to 3. And the 9th hour was from about 3 to 6 p.m. So in Mark chapter 15, verse 25, it states that Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour, which would have been around 9 a.m. So that's whenever he was nailed to the cross. And then Matthew chapter 27, verse 45 says that darkness came over the land. Put a dog in ear in that, because I'm going to come back to that. Darkness came over the land when Jesus died. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, meaning around noon to 3 p.m., it was dark. So again, we'll come back to that. The original Jewish audience would have understood the significance of this timeline. The timing of Jesus' death aligns with Jewish sacrificial practices. Jesus' death at the 9th hour, or around 3 p.m., coincides with the time of the evening sacrifice in the temple. So this is a really symbolic way for the biblical writers to reinforce the idea that Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice or sacrificial lamb, right? So they're telling this story in a way that Jews would have understood. So it's not just the fact that the timeline was communicating something. It's also the way the time was told. Translation of English Bibles, they could say 3 o'clock p.m., right? They could say that. But most keep the language of the Roman imperial timekeeping of 3-hour intervals by saying the 3rd hour, the 6th hour. And this is a powerful way to expose who was doing the crucifying. The Romans. Roman militia was present the entire time. So remember that the Gospels, I always say this because I think it's really important, the Gospels we know were written down after the temple was destroyed in the year 70. The Jews were conquered. They were brutally killed by the Romans, and those who survived, they were paraded naked through the city and then enslaved by Roman households. Surviving Jews who witnessed the Jesus story unfold as children, or who grew up learning about Jesus, they were beaten down by the Romans. They were terrified after the destruction of the temple. So they could not risk writing down anti-Roman things very clearly. So what we now call the Gospels were very kind of mild on the hatred of the oppressive Romans to avoid further humiliation and abuse. So when the writer decided to keep this timekeeping structure, this matters because it exposes the fact that this crucifixion was done by the Romans, because this is how the Romans keep time. That's really important, right?
Yeah, very important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the darkness. The darkness. So the really interesting thing about this timeline, at the moment of Jesus' death, darkness came over the land. But the story states that this was around 3 p.m., right? Which is a time of day when the sun is out and people are at the height of their labors to support the Romans' economic system to make the wealthy wealthier. So this is really good storytelling. This is not about literal darkness, right? So if you're reading this story and you're thinking, oh, wow, that's so weird, it just got dark. It's not. I mean, who knows? Maybe. I don't really care, though. That's not really interesting. What we do know is for the storyteller to state that there was darkness in the early afternoon at the moment of Jesus dying on the cross, that's powerful. Darkness in the early afternoon challenges the natural order of the cosmos and the established power structures. And in apocalyptic Jewish literature, which Jesus and his fellow Jews would have been familiar with, unexpected darkness is often used to signify divine judgment against rulers. So to say that darkness came over the land at the hour of Jesus' death had a clear kind of sentiment to Jesus followers of the time. Justice for the role of Rome in Jesus' death is coming. The world order, as they knew it, was approaching its end. And again, this is brilliant because this was being written down this way, saying, at the moment that Jesus died, darkness came over the land. If Romans picked up this text that we now call Gospels, right? If the Romans picked this up, they were not familiar with Jewish storytelling norms. The writer of the Gospel could not write down that the Roman way was coming to an end. This would have been treason. It would have been punishable by death, and they too would have been hung on a cross just like Jesus. Instead, the writer said, darkness came over the land to tell the Jewish audience that Jesus' death has apocalyptic value. The end of the world, as they knew it, was coming to an end. Something new was coming. Jesus, the way he was teaching, was coming. God is working through this moment to bring down the powerful, like God does again and again in biblical stories. And by the way, this is what apocalyptic literature is all about. Not always about a literal end of the world, but the end of a current arrangement. Darkness came over the land at the moment Jesus died, because Jesus died opposing a system that was deeply harmful. The darkness communicates Rome's lack of control over the world moving forward. Anything to add to that?
No, that was good.
Darkness, yeah?
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about the tearing of the temple, unless you had something else to add.
Nope, that's great.
Okay. So again, this episode is all about Good Friday. And if you read the Gospels, the Good Friday story, the story of Jesus' crucifixion, there's all this symbolic meaning. So if you read it and you think like, oh, wow, the world got dark whenever Jesus died, that can be powerful imagery, I guess, but you're missing what the Jews would have understood, the original writers and audience of the gospel texts. Also, there's the tearing of the temple veil. This is another really important detail in the Good Friday story. So let's talk about what it means. Jesus spoke out against the Romans. He also spoke out against the Jewish elite who were benefiting from the Romans. So Jewish leadership became corrupt because of Roman influence, and Jesus was often speaking out against this. The Pharisees were a huge part of this, right? So, go ahead.
This is very important too. This is a practice that has somewhat kind of gone out of the church, especially Protestant churches. But when it says that the curtain was torn in two, that the veil came down during Lent in many churches, including in Lutheran churches, some Lutheran churches will choose, our own congregation does this. They veil the crosses during Lent, and the cross on Good Friday is then ceremonially taken off. Mm-hmm. It is taken off. The veil is removed. The veil is ripped off. The veil is and that has everything to do with this idea of the curtain. The curtain is torn. The curtain is pulled off. The curtain is.
I'll explain what the veil means, but it's very Oz, like Wizard of Oz.
It is.
Like behind the curtain, kind of.
Right.
Like pulling the curtain back to show you and give access to what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
So, to understand this all, we need to understand what the temple veil was. So, when Jesus was dying on the cross, whenever he died, it said that the world went dark, darkness came over the land. Also, the temple veil tore in half. Right? Does it say in half specifically? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it tore in half. So let's talk about what
I think it's torn in two.
Torn in two. There we go. So the temple veil separated what was called the Holy of Holies, and this is where God's presence was believed to appear. And the high priest in the Jewish temple was the only person with access to the Holy of Holies. So the high priest was the only one who had access to where God's presence was believed to be. Another way to say that is only the Holy of Holies, I'm going to say his because it was always a man, only the Holy of Holies in his position of power gets to access God and nobody else. And what
was interesting too,
even he only had access once a year on Yom Kippur.
1 year on the festival of Yom Kippur, and a rope was tied to his ankle. And therefore, if he touched anything that he wasn't and fell dead, because it was there was this understanding that if anything was touched or misappropriated in the Holy of Holies, the priest would die. And so they would have to pull him out,
so they wouldn't have to go in.
They would have to pull him back in because only the high priest on the festival of Yom Kippur could go into the Holy of Holies. So they'd tie a rope.
They wanted to make sure that he wouldn't die and somebody else had to go.
They would tie a rope so that they could pull him out from behind the curtain.
That's so
I wonder
interesting.
if the Wizard of Oz was pulled out behind the curtain.
So this veil was a symbol that stood for a rigid hierarchy between God, the priestly elite, and the people. So when the crucifixion story includes the detail of the temple veil tearing in two, this hierarchical, that word I always stumble on, religious structure is being challenged and access to God is being decentralized from religious elite, right? The Jesus story is all about everybody has access to God, not just people who the Romans have appointed and who the Romans have decided are worthy and who have kind of climbed this religious ladder, right? So really, again, brilliant Jewish storytelling. It is the storyteller's way of saying that Jesus' death is filled with meaning. Jesus died for his cause, and his cause rejected this gatekeeping of God from the common people, from the people living in poverty, from the people at the bottom of the totem pole. So the tearing of the veil, it probably didn't literally happen, right? I don't
think it did.
Yeah, but, I don't think it did.
But that doesn't matter to me.
I don't. It's not interesting to me to debate whether or not it really happened. Right. It was meaning. It was true without being factual.
Well, and it was this idea, as you just said, that the Holy of Holies, God who is the most holy, which I would 110% agree with, is not this inaccessible God. It's this God that, like you said, the people on the margins can particularly experience. I'm going to get myself in trouble by making this connection here, but I'm going to. So this is a powerful part of the Good Friday story about the curtain being torn in two and the veil being pulled and off, and all these things, all this imagery. This having full access to God, not having to have this intermediary between God, but to have full access to God. It's very interesting because the Christian Church, in both the Roman Catholic tradition and the Eastern Orthodox tradition, especially in the Roman Catholic tradition in the medieval period, they started to once again separate people from God, and that came in with chancel rails. And so there was this idea that the priest or the pastor was the only one at that time. They didn't have too many assisting people behind there, that they were the only ones that were permitted to be in the chancel with the Holy Scriptures and the sacraments, and that everyone else had to kind of be out of there. And so our own tradition, our own Christian tradition for hundreds of years, brought kind of this idea of, well, you're kind of out there and God is over here, and there's a separation. And so many churches, including the current Roman Catholic Church since the 1960s and 70s, and many other Protestant churches, have removed chancel rails, not chancels themselves, a very distinct part of the church, not the chancel, but the chancel rail, in opening it up for people to know that God's arms truly are opened and out for when the Scriptures are read and preached, and when the sacraments are administered and received.
And the pastor doesn't have more access.
And the pastor doesn't have
else.
more access than anyone else. The pastor is being used as an instrument of God's word and sacrament that is given to the people. And so the idea that the space is still distinctly defined, the rail or the separation, just like that of the curtain in the Good Friday story, is God is a God of open arms with no barriers, a radical hospitality.
And the symbolism matters. Those rails being taken down matter.
Absolutely.
When you do children's sermons, we call them children's chats, and you have the kids come back, like, behind, what is that called? What's that area called?
The chancel.
The chancel, that matters.
Oh, it does, absolutely.
A really quick side tangent, too, is, I like to bring it up every time it comes up. Those rails were not original to church structure. They were put there because churches used to have wide open doors. Anybody could come up there, including wild dogs, and wild dogs would poop and pee all over the church. So railing was put up to keep the dogs out so they wouldn't pee all over everything. And then eventually, churches got doors, and those doors started to lock and all kinds of things. So dogs now aren't coming in anymore. The railing starts to be more like open fence kind of railing just for decoration. And then eventually the church is like, wait, we don't even need these anymore. And then people started to interpret it as this, like, the pastor's on high and everybody else is separated. So it matters to have them not there, so there's not a separation. And
if you go into some of the most ancient of churches that were during the Jesus movement, and then even in the 4th and 5th and 6th century, especially in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, you won't find chancel rails.
Right.
They're not in the most ancient churches.
Well, in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, that's the earliest that there were, like, formal churches.
Yeah, because before then you had small community house churches.
Right. Christianity wasn't formalized. Okay.
Right.
So good. Okay, so I should have said this first. We're going to talk about that thief on the cross that everybody loves.
Ooh, I'm going to talk about that thief on the cross at this Good Friday service.
Oh, good. So we're going to talk about thief on the cross. I should have brought this up first, though, because I feel like we talked about the moment of Jesus' death. So let's rewind a little bit, because he talks to the thief on the cross before he dies.
Do you know the name? Hanging. Do you know the name that the early church gave to this person?
Tell me. I do know it as soon as you say
it. And this person is the patron saint of...
I hate when you do this, because I hate not knowing things. What is it? I know
You're funny. The thief on the cross who is next to Jesus, in which Jesus turns. Samantha will tell the whole story, but Jesus he turns and he talks to Jesus, and then Jesus says to him, "You'll be with me in paradise." Beautiful story. But the early church, there was no name ever given to this person in the scriptures, and so the early church wanted to, in order to give this person more validity, that they not only made this person a saint, a special person, but they named him Saint Dismas. Saint Dismas. And Saint Dismas is the patron saint, or the patron of those who are incarcerated. And so, if any type of pastor or lay person is involved in lay ministry, they know that the patron saint is Saint Dismas. And the Lutheran Church, the ELCA at least, to which our denomination is, they have the Society of Saint Dismas, in which pastors and deacons in the Lutheran Church are able to join in terms of giving prison ministry, and it's it's the Society of Saint Dismas. And it was they used to come to the seminary at Gettysburg and ask for people to volunteer to be chaplains at state and local prisons. Yeah,
I'm fighting the urge to talk about just prisons in general right now because of everything in our world and politics. But I'm trying to stay on task.
It might derail us.
Yeah, in a big way.
But remember Saint Dismas.
Okay, thief on the cross. So, I have a feeling that whatever you're going to preach about on Friday is not going to align with my very firm beliefs about the thief on the cross.
Well, my reflection, like it is every Good Friday, is I write a poem from the viewpoint of one of the figures that were at the crucifixion. So the first time I did Mary, Jesus' mother. The second year I did it from the Roman centurion. From their
I was there.
point of view, and then this year I'm doing it from the thief on the cross. It's more of a poetic meditation that I do. It has no historic.
I'm about to talk a lot of crap on a very dominant interpretation of the thief on the cross. So are you ready?
Yeah. Well,
when people were
you're
crucified,
not going to upset me.
When people were crucified by the Romans, they placed these plaques above their heads, labeling their crimes. So above Jesus' head on the cross, there was a plaque that read, "King of the Jews." To be called a king in the Roman Empire...
Written in how many languages?
3 different languages.
Which ones? This is like confirmation all over.
Aramaic. I don't know. What?
Latin, Greek, and Hebrew.
That's interesting. It was in Greek too?
Yeah, Greek.
Huh.
Yeah, because you had the Hellenistic Jews.
Right.
You had Latin, which was the official language of the Roman Empire. And there was Hebrew, which was the official language. I mean, most people spoke the vernacular of Aramaic,
right,
but the official language is Hebrew.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed Greek. Okay. Very interesting. Dillon is really touching. Oh, I hate when he knows things that I don't. Oh, I hate it. Okay.
Oh, she knows so much more.
But that's good.
Than
I
me.
learned. Okay. So above Jesus' head, there was a plaque that read "King of the Jews" in 3 languages.
And what were they?
Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. So to be called a king in the Roman Empire, this was akin to committing treason, which is a crime the Romans took very seriously. Actually, it's a crime that continues to be taken very seriously in the United States and throughout the world. And oppressive governments, they demand loyalty. And they do not tolerate criticism. So just a little side tangent. When we find ourselves in a political situation where those in power do not create space for criticism of the way they hold power, we know there is oppression, and we are in a situation similar to Jesus. Jesus was killed by the state for criticizing because the Romans didn't allow space for criticism. He was murdered for treason. Jesus is said to have hung on a cross between 2 thieves. So he was being charged with treason, and he was on a cross because they hung multiple people at once. So there were 3 crosses, right? Oftentimes that's like imagery. On top of the hill where crosses usually were, because it was a public statement to say, don't disobey the Romans, this is what will happen to you. We often will see like paintings or just images of 3 crosses, right?
But usually those images or those depictions is that the central cross or the cross in the middle is larger than the other 2. That is not necessarily historic.
Right.
That is very much a
Lifting up the meaning of
Christocentric artistic motif.
choice. Yeah, there you go. So Jesus hung on a cross between two thieves. That's the story that we get. Now in Greek, thieves are called, I'm not going to say this word right, lestai. Lestai is the transliteration. And an accurate translation for these thieves, many would argue a better translation would be bandits.
Yeah. Well, that's what the NRSV has.
Right. So we call them thieves on the cross. There was this thief on the cross, but he was actually between two thieves. And it was very common for bandits to be crucified for their crimes. In fact, bandits were one of the most common people crucified
And they were usually
in the Roman Empire.
Violent offenders.
Right.
So they weren't just thieves that stole something. They were bandits that stole like there's a difference there's a difference between a thievery, so someone who's a thief, and someone who's a burglar. So these people were more like burglars in that they were people that brought violence, and they usually had like a club or they had a knife.
Okay,
or
so that's let's talk about that. Let's keep that in mind.
So those are two different things. Even today, in today's law, a thief and a burglar are two different things.
Right, but this word bandit is really important, and we're going to talk about zealots, and we're really going to nuance this. So you can't just have a bucket of good people, bad people. So let's just start there. So these bandits, here's what's really interesting about these thieves who are hanging on crosses next to Jesus dying, or bandits. In the context of Roman imperialism, bandits were often connected to the political movement taking place. And these bandits were often connected to the same movement that Jesus was in some ways a part of, right? Meaning they had the same... I know a lot of times people are like, Jesus loved his enemies. Jesus never says to love the Romans. Jesus did have an enemy, the Romans. And he didn't go around saying like, oh, just accept them. They're just that way. No, he was against the Romans, right?
Well, you could still love someone without.
But Jesus didn't go around preaching to love the Romans. I'm not saying he shouldn't.
Approve of their behavior, correct?
Right. I just think that we do a disservice with the Jesus story sometimes when we would boil it down to like, well, Jesus said to love everybody. And like, yes, there's a lot of love there. And Jesus called out oppressive behavior that was hurting people at the bottom.
Well,
he
a lot of
people
called
it out. He didn't call like, go, you need to forgive everybody. No, there were some lines you can pull out, but a huge part of his ministry was the Romans are hurting us and we need to act out against this.
Well, one of the problems with Christianity is, and even in the tradition that we are, that is more inclusive or progressive or whatever, we reduce Jesus and Jesus's teachings to like a 1960s hippie.
Yeah.
And worse, we reduce them to Jesus no longer becomes an actual historical figure who walked life and changed people's lives through his teachings and his reforms, but we reduce him to almost kind of a legendary figure, almost like a figure that like
non-human.
Well, like you're supposed to be like Jesus, but you can never really be like him, because we have made him like a fictional character.
Yes.
And he wasn't.
We almost
at all
romanticized him.
Yeah, we almost make him.
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone would get this reference, but we make Jesus sometimes like precious momentsy.
Yeah.
You know, the precious moments, like the little Christian little Christian stories. They're cute. They're fine. They're not my favorite, but we reduce Jesus to like.
Like a Hallmark movie.
Well, I know what I really want to say, but I can't say it because it would be too mean. But yeah, it's just, and yet, I do think that Jesus was, because I believe that Jesus came in the fullness of the form of God, that Jesus is God. I affirm that, and yet I think Jesus wasn't a doormat.
We do the same thing with Jesus of Nazareth that we do with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King
Right,
Jr. We do the same thing. We have watered down, all of us white people on MLK Day, we like to be like, oh yes, and lift up his words. But the truth is, he was hated so much during his time for his civil rights activism that he was murdered.
Yeah, right, that he was murdered.
And even non-Christians like to lift up his words without remembering that he was a reverend. He was a pastor. This came out of his Christianity.
And that his doctorate was in theology.
Right.
The Reverend
He was religiously
Doctor.
motivated. And yet non-Christians and white people like to lift him up on their Facebook page and just like put quotes. And listen, that's fine. But we need to remember that he was a human. He was not liked, and he was ultimately killed for his work. Jesus was similar. He was a human. He was not well liked by a lot of people in power, and he was ultimately killed for it. He was a dangerous person to the world order of the day.
Right, and
he wasn't just love, love, love. Yeah, yes, and...
Well, I think Jesus was a person of justice.
Yeah.
And in Jesus's justice, which we very much see as we're talking about through the Good Friday story, you do see a person that is radically inclusive, radically welcoming, radically loving, radically forgiving and merciful, and filled with the fullness of God's grace, and brought about, and I know some people cringe at this word, but I'm being very expansive, and brought about salvation. And when I'm talking about salvation, I'm talking about changing people's lives in the here and now. I'm not saying that it has nothing to do with the hereafter or the afterlife. You can include that too. But Jesus brought salvific or salvation to people's everyday life that we speak about in the Lord's Prayer. Bring us our daily bread and forgive us our debts, forgive us our trespasses, forgive the things that are ripping us apart and starting to renew them and to bring God's presence here. So the whole idea of the Good Friday story is, it's deep. It's deeply powerful.
We can close by talking about like the theology behind, not the theology, but the meaning behind it. Let's talk about that after we let me go back to the bandits before I forget.
Okay. Oh, sure.
That was a good side tangent.
Yeah.
So the bandits, they were thieves, right? But we have to connect them to the political movement that was taking place. These bandits were stealing in an act of rebellion against a Roman system of wealth and hoarding of resources and enslavement and injustice, right? This is the same thing that Jesus was speaking out against. Now, Jesus had very different approaches to how we do this. Jesus wasn't advocating that we steal and that we bring violence, but they were at the bottom. Jesus was at the bottom of the totem pole. He was living with people who were in poverty. He's from the town of Nazareth, which was a town that had such little resources, right? His family had little resources. And then you have these people who he grew up with and these fellow Jews, right? And they were also stealing and acting out against the same system Jesus was teaching against. They were on the same side, if you want to paint it that way. So Jesus tells one of the bandits, again, I do want to stress Jesus's posture towards it. His ideas of how you align against oppression were very different from the bandits, right?
Yeah, because you see that in the story, which is spoken of actually tomorrow on Wednesday in Holy Week. You get the story of Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus with the 30 pieces of silver, and you also then the next day on Thursday, on Maundy Thursday, you get the idea when Jesus right before he was taken, and then Good Friday comes. You get the story of him in the Garden of Gethsemane with some of his disciples. He was in prayer, and then he was arrested. And Peter must have been, well, I shouldn't say must have been. There's much historical writings about this. He was a little bit of an itchy person in that he was just always kind of concerned, it seemed, with certain things, and we find this in the stories of the scriptures, that he cut off the ear of someone, and Jesus rebuked that and said, Peter, you do not act in violence like that.
Right.
And then Jesus, obviously, he actually heals the man who puts his ear back on, whether or not that
Right.
it doesn't matter. But Jesus heals this person and said, no, we resist, but we do not resist in violence.
Right.
We do not do that.
Well, Jesus and this thief on the cross were dying in rebellion to the same system, although they rebelled in different ways. They had different methods of rebellion, but they still had a common enemy or a common person. I don't like the word enemy, but
I
a
know what you
common
mean.
person, a common system they were aligned against, which is the Roman Empire. So this statement is Jesus recognizing that there's more to this man's crime. So this line about the thief on the cross, when Jesus says, you will be with me in paradise, right? It cannot be interpreted in that way that we often hear. Oh, well, if you just repent in your dying death, just like the thief on the cross, right? All of your wrongs will be forgiven and you'll go to heaven. Like, whenever I hear about people being like, well, the thief on the cross, right? He was next to Jesus and Jesus told him that I'll see you in paradise. We can read it that one way, but there's a lot more going on.
And that isn't a wrong way to read it, but that's not the only way to read
Right.
it. It's actually not the only historic way to read it either.
I resist a Christianity that centralizes itself around it. If I believe the right thing in the right way, then I go to heaven. The afterlife is always addressed in religion, and I get that. And I'm sure later on in life, or if illness hits me or anything, then the afterlife will be more of a concern of mine. So I don't want to operate too much from like a privileged stance, because I understand that afterlife is a concern for people. It is not the only concern though, and it can't be the central theme, because it for sure wasn't the central thing Jesus was talking about. Jesus was much more interested in the oppression and the harm being done here, now, on earth, like right now. He was interested in politics. He was interested in the earth. He was interested in oppression. He was interested in poverty and wealth and all of these things that we're still interested in today, right?
This is good that you're bringing this up. Can I share this one thing?
Yeah.
There's an interesting thing though about the thief of the cross, in that he is in a life and death situation. Mm-hmm. So he's not getting that thief on the cross, or the bandit on the cross, which was better terminology.
And Jews would have understood bandit to likely be aligned against the Roman Empire.
So that man is hanging on a cross, not to be gross or grotesque here, but that man was hanging on a cross with nails in his feet and his hands, and he was not getting down. He was going to die. And this conversation between him and Jesus is very interesting, in which Jesus tells him, you'll be with me in paradise. Paradise has nothing to do with heaven, number one. That's for a different episode. But Jesus, you'll be with me in paradise, is saying in many ways that Jesus might have not condoned his violent behavior as a bandit, but when and if this individual, this bandit, was fighting because maybe he was in poverty and Rome was taking advantage of him and perhaps his family, Jesus is turning to him and he's saying, you will be with me. Both of us are going to die. Your work here on earth is not in vain.
That's my whole point.
And
is
so
if we understand that the bandit was aligned against the Romans, just like Jesus saying, you will be with me in paradise, is not saying, oh, you've done bad things, but don't worry, you're saved in the end. It is more than that. It's him saying, I see the suffering that has led you here at the hands of the Romans and oppression. I know who you are, and don't worry, you'll be with me. I'm with you, is essentially what he's saying. It's I'm with you. I see it. We are now here dying at the hands of the Romans, and I'm with you.
But there was a belief at that time that if you were arrested, if you were a bandit, if you were you were going to have some punishment in the hereafter, in the afterlife, and so there was a lot going on here. So
well, let's break that wide open, because none of us have a clean dollar in our bank accounts.
Right.
We're all part of the corrupt system.
Right.
So we're all going to have
right. So this is so powerful in both the here, current, and the hereafter. Jesus saying, again, I may not condone you being a bandit and acting in violence, but you're pushing for reforms and to get rid of oppression. your actions are not in vain, and the very person who created you, meaning God, you're going to die today, and trust that what you have done here on earth is not in vain, and you will go on into something greater. That there is a both and thing there.
Yes.
That's powerful, and I'm glad that you brought that up.
It is. So let's stick with before the moment of Jesus' death, before the tearing of the veil, before the darkness comes over the land. So the thief on the cross is a huge part of the Good Friday story. Another huge part is, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Maybe we should talk about that before you do that. In the Good Friday service, the Good Friday liturgy, in most churches, many pastors or priests or whatever their sermons will a lot of times connect to what is known as the 7 last words of Jesus. And so Samantha's going to talk about one of them, probably one of the most famous ones, but the 7 last words of Jesus. Sometimes people will just reflect on those during the liturgy of Good Friday.
Are you going to tell us what they are?
I can. I didn't know if you wanted to start or how you...
Well...
I mean, there's a lot of them, and we also have... I mean, if that's what you want...
No. So, my God, why have you forsaken me? Let's talk about that.
Did not just come from the lips of Jesus.
What?
Did not just come from the lips of Jesus.
I don't know what you're saying.
Oh, but you talk about it.
No, what are you saying? What do you mean?
Some people that have not done biblical studies say that, well, that was something new. Jesus just said that. Like, why did Jesus say that? Well, Jesus is quoting scripture.
Oh, yes.
And you're going to talk about that.
I thought you were saying Jesus didn't actually say that.
Oh, no. I think that Jesus
did say it. Okay.
But and someone recorded it.
I was very confused.
I thought
you were about to throw my whole thing and be like, no, actually, Jesus never said that. I'm like, I've never come across that knowledge. Okay.
No. Well,
okay, so God.
I'm sorry, I confused you and the hearing audience.
That's all right. So Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And people have spent a lot of time debating, like, well, if there's Trinitarian theology, and if Jesus is God and God is Jesus and blah, 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 then how could Jesus be crying out to God, right? That, again, for whatever reason, I don't know why that's not interesting to me. Whatever. But here is what we know about my God, why have you forsaken me? So again, you can read this in Matthew chapter 27, verse 46, in Mark chapter 15, verse 34. So we need to remember, like always, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was Jewish. His followers were Jewish. Many people who watched the crucifixion in real time, in real life, were Jewish. Now, the book of Psalms, this was a central part of Jewish life, a central part of Jewish worship and scripture in Jesus's time.
And most of the time, people would have had the Psalms memorized, because the Psalms were not just spoken; they were sung or chanted,
so
and
people knew them.
People knew the rhythmicness of these. They weren't just words on a page, but they were songs and chants that they would know from the temple, from the synagogue.
Right. So the Psalms were included in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and like Dillon just said, they were also sung. Jews knew the Psalms, is our point. And these were used in synagogue services, prayers, personal devotions, right? And Jesus frequently would reference the Psalms in his teaching. So if you're familiar with the Psalms and you're familiar with Jesus's teachings, you can see a lot of overlap there. So remember, the Psalms were not numbered. The Bible was not numbered the way we have it numbered now with like chapters and verses. So you couldn't be like, oh, Psalm 22, verse 1, right? That's not how it worked. Instead, the Jewish people referenced the Psalms by reciting the first line. So when somebody would recite the first line, they were referencing the whole Psalm. Just like if I were to say Psalm 22. But if you said the first line of Psalm 22, there was no Psalm 22. They weren't numbered.
For Christians, this is actually good that you're bringing this up. For Christians, if I was to say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Right. Very few Christians would not know, that's Psalm 23.
Right.
Because you don't even have to say the whole Psalm. And
We have it memorized.
And people know it. People memorize it.
Right.
It's one of the most famous.
But now imagine there is no number 22 or 23.
Right.
That wasn't used yet in Scripture.
Right.
So Psalm 22 begins with the line, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And there were Jewish witnesses to the crucifixion. There were a lot of people, right? So when he yells out, cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's referencing this entire psalm. He's referencing the entirety of Psalm 22. This was a very common thing in Jewish practice. This was very common. So he for sure was referencing the entire psalm. Now let's talk about Psalm 22. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to say something. The day before Good Friday is known as Maundy Thursday or Holy Thursday. And during the stripping of the altar, in which everything is taken out of the chancel and off the altar and off the pulpit and everything, all the decorative things are taken away. They're stripped, just like Jesus was stripped of his clothes. Someone either sings or they speak Psalm 22.
Right.
Preparing, going from Maundy Thursday, Jesus washing the feet of his disciples and having the meal of bread and wine with them, to going into the garden, to being arrested, stripped of his clothes and put on a scarlet robe, and then leading into my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Psalm 22,
Right.
which then sets you up beautifully to come back to church again on Good Friday, which leads into his death.
Right. Now, if you're interested, go back and read all of Psalm 22. But Psalm 22 begins with anguish. My God, why have you forsaken me? But then it ends in hope and trust. It says things like, I am scorned by others and despised by the people. That's Psalm 22, verse 6, right? And obviously in that moment, Jesus was being scorned by others and despised by many people. And then the psalm goes on to say, all who see me mock me. They sneer at me. They shake their heads. Again, Jesus was experiencing this in the moment that he references this psalm. It's kind of brilliant, actually. The psalm also reads, for he did not despise or abhor, that's such a weird word, abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him. Making the point, like, yeah, it starts with my God, why have you forsaken me? But then it ends with like, oh, God is actually here with me in this moment, in this suffering. The divine is here. This moment, God is in this too. So it ends with hope. To us, it seems like Jesus isn't sure if God is present. To us, it's just like, oh, God is scared and saying, God, or Jesus is scared, God, where did you go? But actually, and the Romans hear this. This is what's super interesting. Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Romans aren't super familiar with Jewish customs. So the Romans hear Jesus crying out in anguish. They think he's suffering. They don't hear the hope that the Jews in the audience undoubtedly understood from Jesus crying out in reference to Psalm 22. Does that make sense the way I'm explaining it? Mm-hmm. So the Jews watching Jesus die on the cross, they would have known this psalm. They would have heard Jesus' message loud and clear that even in his pain, with nails piercing through his limbs, Jesus was communicating hope and God's presence in the here and now, even in the face of Roman-induced suffering and murder. So, again, what is especially interesting about this is that the Romans think Jesus is just crying out in pain and doubting his God. However, where the oppressors see pain, the Jews recognized hope.
That's so good.
So good.
That's so good.
Yeah. So, again, if you're ever in a conversation where people are like, oh, well, why did he cry out to God? Now you know he was referencing a psalm. He was making a larger point that the Jews would have understood. And
if you attend or you'd like to attend a liturgical church on Good Friday, you should go to a Good Friday service at a liturgical church, because you're going to hear all of these things. You're going to hear things like the Passion from John's Gospel read or sung. You're going to see things and hear things that we have talked about in this episode. Two things that I would like to just offer, that if you go to a Good Friday service or a Good Friday liturgy at a liturgical church, you're going to find two things, most likely. And these practices come from a woman named Egeria, and Egeria wrote in the 4th century, and she was a Roman woman who devoted her life to Christianity, and she would travel throughout Jerusalem, and she would write these, what we now call little postcards, back to the other churches. And this was in the 4th century, this Roman woman, Egeria. And she wrote about what was going on on Good Friday. And when she wrote back to the other churches, she told them that there was a procession of the cross and adoration of the cross. Adoration means looking upon the cross and meditatively remembering that which had happened to Jesus on the cross. And it's interesting, Egeria offers this procession. So in the Lutheran Church and many other liturgical churches, at the end of the Good Friday service, the Good Friday liturgy, the pastor and someone else will process a cross, usually a crucifix with Jesus on the cross. Process it.
Process means walk.
Process means walk. Walk very slowly. They'll walk it down the center of the aisle, and they'll place the cross either on the altar or near the altar. They'll pull off the veil, the black veil, and you'll look upon the cross of Jesus, to which Jesus was crucified. So it's processed and walked down. And these are the words in the Lutheran liturgy service, and this is what the people say as the cross is coming down. The pastor chants and sings, "Behold the life-giving cross on which hung the Savior of the whole world." And the people will chant back, "Oh, come, let us worship him." And as long as it takes the cross to come down the aisle, if you have a long aisle, well, then you're saying it lots of times. If you have a short aisle, then not so much. You just keep repeating that back and forth. And then it is... It's placed on the altar, the veil is pulled off, and the pastor says, "We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. By your holy cross, you have redeemed the world." And so there's this back and forth, looking at the cross, remembering what it has, how it has transformed the world, remembering the 7 last words of Jesus on the cross. It's a very powerful experience to sit at and reflect on. Thoughts?
No, that's good. That's really good. I'm trying to think of Good Friday services. I feel like I've been to a couple, but then I also think we've had babies in the past few years, so I've missed some.
And also very, very much held historic custom on Good Friday, even among Protestants, is to not eat meat.
Yeah, let's talk about that kind of in closing. I want to...
So real quick, so a lot of Protestants, it's not the most universal practice to not eat meat on Fridays during Lent. Many Protestants won't eat meat on Fridays in Lent, but it's not something that's required. It's something that people choose to do. But many Protestant traditions won't eat meat during Lent on 2 days, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Mm-hmm. And so that has been those 2 days of Ash Wednesday and Good Friday during Lent for even Protestants have been 2 days where you don't eat meat. Do you want to get into that, you said, or to close with that?
Well, I want to talk about Good Friday. Well, I'm just going to get into it. I want to finish by talking about Good Friday is the day of death. Holy Saturday is the day that Jesus is said to have descended to the depths. And Easter is about his resurrection. Now, no matter what you believe about what is literally true and what historically happened, again, is not that interesting. What's more interesting is that if you think about a time in your life where there is transformation, because the Easter story is ultimately about transformation, there is a pattern. First the death, then the descent, then the rising. So to make this really basic, think about a caterpillar. It has to go into a cocoon, right? It has to die of its own old caterpillar ways, right? It is no longer going to be a caterpillar crawling in the dirt. Now it's going to go into the cocoon, which is the descent, the darkness, the goo, the nothingness, the formlessness. We can call it limbo, we can call it purgatory, we can call it whatever. We experience it here and now. And then it rises as a butterfly. It's transformed to something new. That is the process of transformation. Think about any time in your life whenever you transformed for the better, when something happened, something old had to die. Nothing new can ever occur in our lives until something old dies. That's the Jesus story, right? So this isn't just a bunch of like old church, like there's a reason this story has lasted for so long. One is colonialism, and we can't ignore that. We cannot ignore the harms of that. And yet, this story is powerful because Jesus, the story of Jesus that we have is he dies to his old 100% human form. I don't know if that's theologically accurate to say it. Dillon's kind of nodding. And then he descends to the depths. Another word for descending to the depths in our human language could be depression. Right? Some people, whenever something old, like think about sobriety, people who die to their old drug using or drinking selves, right? Whenever they're moving into sobriety, which is a type of transformation, parts of their old selves have to die. And that old self will die. They'll stop drinking, they'll stop using, but they don't transform right away, right? They are not resurrecting like Jesus right away. First, they have to descend. And that looks like darkness. It looks like confusion. It looks like depression. It can also look like a whole lot of nothing. Like, okay, great, I stopped drinking, or I stopped using drugs, or I stopped shopping mindlessly, or I stopped gambling, or whatever it is. And then you can think, okay, but nothing new has happened. Like, it just feels like nothing. And that can go on for a while until, boom, transformation comes. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
Like, this is the pattern of life. Death, descent, rise. There is no resurrection. There is no transformation without dying. It just can't exist. And I don't mean dying in the literal sense all the time, although that's one way to transform into something else. But also, we die all the time. I am not who I was 10 years ago.
Oh, right.
There are 100 versions of me that have died.
Right.
And a lot of those were painful. All of them were painful in some way to varying degrees, right? So this Good Friday story matters. If you're a church-going person like us, go to Good Friday services if you can, if your schedule allows, because going like Palm Sunday, which has this like celebrative kind of tone, and it's glory to glory, that doesn't work. And then going to Easter, it just feels like the whole thing is happy, but you're forgetting the Good Friday, and you're forgetting the Holy Saturday, which is about descending to the depths. And we have a culture that doesn't know how to grieve. We have a culture that doesn't know how to do darkness, which is why we don't transform. Listen, Dillon knows that I could go on and on and on about this, but that like our culture doesn't know how to do sadness, grief, darkness. And if you don't learn how to grieve over the parts of yourself and your culture and your systems and your whole life that are dying, you will never see transformation if you can't surrender to the grief of it all. If you can't do Holy Saturday, if you can't observe Good Friday, if you can't see the dying on the cross, if you can't die on your own crosses, to really beat a dead metaphor here, then there will be no resurrection. We have to learn how to die and descend first. Okay.
Some people would and will totally disagree with me on this, and that is just fine. But one of the greatest things that came out of the 1960s and the 1970s with the church reforms in the Protestant and Catholic churches is that people started to not go to church on Good Friday for a multitude of reasons. Work schedules changed. Extracurricular activities were even starting to become a part of practices and games on that day. And society and culture have changed. And I'm not talking about a culture war here. I'm just saying the amount of people that would attend services on Good Friday at church and hear the story of Jesus' passion had and remain abysmal amount of people that go. And so the church started to wake up to this. And in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Roman Catholic and the Protestant churches introduced something new. it is no longer, or at least it shouldn't be, just Palm Sunday. That's the common name for it, but it is Palm Passion Sunday. People weren't going to church or can't get to church on Good Friday, and so in the beginning of Palm Sunday, you hear the glorious story of Jesus and the palms and the blessing of palms and him riding in on a donkey to Jerusalem, and it's a celebratory time. But at the end of that day, we are reminded of the passion and death of Jesus and the cross that leads us into what Easter is going to bring. And so we now have Palm Passion Sunday, which gives us both bookends, the joyousness of the palms and the blessing of the palms and the story, and also the passion of Jesus. And yet, even if you went to Palm Passion Sunday, I would still encourage you to reflect on the Passion story on Good Friday, even if it's in your own home, or go to church on Good Friday. Find some place to go with a community and experience a Good Friday service, because it truly does transform. If you hear the story of Good Friday on Easter Sunday and reflect on Holy Saturday, going into the depths and him in the tomb and in the gate, enlivening people from the depths, that makes Easter Sunday, so much more glorious, especially when you say that word with the A-L-L-E-U-I, whatever that word is.
That's what our next episode is going to be about. Yeah, so I just wanted to end by saying, like, this isn't just a bunch of hokum pokum that people are just like, oh, great, Good Friday, but there's a reason, because it speaks to something very real in our lives. Death, descent, rise. First the death, then the descent, then the rising. You can't have it any other way. It just doesn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't work.
And you gotta have life before that too.
Right. Ooh, that's a good thing to talk about. Dillon, what was that?
Life, death, descent, resurrection.
Oh, no, okay. What was that documentary called that we just watched? I forget. Was it like the Soldiers of God or something?
Oh, yeah. It was about a really radical Pentecostal.
It doesn't matter. We watched this documentary because that's our idea of a good time, is documentaries. And there are these kids. They're like 6 years old, 5 years old, and they're saying that they're born again. But here's the thing. You can't be born again until you first have an identity to die to.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Father Richard Rohr, he talks about the first half of life and the second half of life, right? You can't crave transformation until first there's something in you that can die. That's why children and even young adults are allowed to have an ego. You can't die to your ego until you first build up your ego. It's necessary for spiritual growth. You have to be something and like have bad habits to get you through adolescence and like breaking free of your parents. And I don't know if bad habits is the best way to put it, but you know what I mean? I think people by this point know what ego means. You can't die to your ego until you have an ego to die to. That's what childhood and adolescence and young adulthood is all about. So whenever I see in this documentary real footage of children about the age of our daughter Tabitha saying they were born again, how can you be born again? You can't be born again until you die to something, and you don't have a sense of self to die to yet. Like you don't, like you're 5. There's no way. There's a lot to unpack. It's a pet peeve of mine. It is wild to me to be teaching children that they need to die to something when they don't even know who they are yet. They're still figuring it out. Like we're trying to hand children, which is so problematic, the faith of an adult. Which is like, no, they don't have... Dillon's cringing because we really need to unpack a lot of that. Maybe some episode we will. But children can't be born again yet. They can only be taught things.
But now we're going to have to go.
We'll do it for 2 minutes.
We need to close this out. I wouldn't use that language, but Jesus uses that language, and when he talks to Nicodemus. But Nicodemus, hold on.
But that translation could be, it's born from above.
Well, it's also born of water and spirit, which we know is reflections on a lot of things like mikvahs, and then obviously ritual bathing, which now becomes baptism.
Okay, but how old was he wasn't talking to a child.
Correct. That's what I was just going to say.
Right.
Nicodemus was
an
an adult. And yet now, I mean, in our own tradition, in our own Lutheran tradition, we wouldn't say born again. We wouldn't even say born of above, but we would say have
Baptized into the faith.
Have been baptized
Well,
into the faith.
we already did an episode on baptism.
But here's the thing. It's very interesting because that's a gift of God, nothing that we have to do. So it's not like you have to say, well, I don't want. There's a lot. We open a can
Dylan
of worms
and I
here.
have strong opinions about that.
We
but
open a can of worms here. So let's.
Good Friday, death, descent, resurrection is what we're going to leave you with.
Yes.
All right. Stay curious.
Stay curious. Stay curious.
To understand